Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Road to Damascus. Today, I want to look at a very interesting question. Why do we say Jesus was without sin throughout his whole life and ministry? We can accept that when Jesus was born, until the time that he was crucified and died and then subsequently resurrected, his life was full of positive deeds and he didn't commit sin. But Jesus was born out of a human being called Mary. And it's widely accepted in Christian theology that on the basis of Adam and Eve eating of the forbidden fruit in the Garden of Eden, sin entered the world, and any human being born subsequently thereof out of Adam and Eve were born in sin, right? So by virtue of you being a human being, being born out of a human being, we are born with sin. But somehow that did not apply to Jesus, because it's widely accepted that Jesus, throughout his whole life and ministry, was without sin at all, right? How is that possible? That's the question. How was a human being, even though Jesus was part God or was God, he also walked amongst us as a human. So how does a human being born out of a human being exist without sin? That's a very interesting thing to discuss, or at least to look into. And to address this, I think, at least in the Catholic doctrine or in the Catholic theology, there's this concept of immaculate conception. And surprisingly, immaculate conception doesn't apply to the conception of Jesus, but rather it applies to the conception of the Virgin Mary, who is the mother of Jesus. And in simple terms, what this means is that Mary was born without sin. The question is, how is that possible? And how did that happen, right? And to look into this, one way you can begin to sort of piece together how that might have occurred or might have been possible is that there is the doctrine that was instituted by Pope Pius IV, I think in the 1800s, on this Immaculate Conception, and I think it's documented in the Fabulous Duo, which is sort of the doctrine that established this concept of Immaculate Conception. And basically, how it goes is that when Mary was being born, right, out of Saint Anne and her father Joachim, it's basically the infant Mary received a special grace from God, right? And on the basis of that, her conception happened without this sin being transferred to her. And it's very hard for me to personally to accept how that could happen. But some of the reasons that I put forward is that when Angel Gabriel visited Mary at the time that she was going to conceive Jesus, basically Gabriel said that you are full of grace and the Lord is with you. These are some of the passages that are pulled out to try to sort of justify and support that Mary was a special type of human being that existed, right? So she was a special type of woman that existed. For some reason, she was incorruptible herself, and that was the basis on which she could carry the presence of God or God Himself and bring God into the world. So the whole thinking is that God has to exist in a pure state and without sin. And so for a vessel to be able to carry God or the presence of God and bring it forth into the world, that vessel itself must be pure or incorruptible. And for God to be able to prepare that vessel, God had to deal with, make sure that vessel came into the world without any incorruptibility. And on the basis of that, when Mary was being conceived, there was a special grace that God imbued at the conception of Mary, that Mary was born without this original sin. Now, one of the key, you might say, well, anybody can make this claim. How sure are we that this is true? Of course, there aren't direct passages in the Bible that supports this, right? That Mary was born without sin. But you could sort of deduce that how is it possible that Mary was able to why was Mary specifically chosen to carry the presence of God and bring forth Jesus? And there had to be something special about her. And we see it in the way Gabriel acknowledged Mary, and also when we look at some of the comments that are made in Luke 1:42, where basically it says, "Blessed are you amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb, Jesus," right? So it says that, okay, what is coming out of Mary's womb is special. It's very unique. It's free of blemish and stuff like that. You could deduce that from that. And on the basis of that, we know that her womb was blessed, right? Because the fruit of her womb was Jesus. And then if you say, okay, she is also blessed amongst women, you could make some kind of inference that she was also a special human being. And that's what made it possible for her to be the vessel through which God could come into the world as Jesus Christ. So to make it simple, some of the reasons that Pope Pius IV might have used to sort of canonize this Immaculate Conception, or this doctrine of Immaculate Conception, sort of dates back to some of the early church fathers. And throughout my research, there was one that kept popping up, which is basically according to some of the early church fathers, most of the early church fathers were even comparing Mary as a human being to Eve herself, right? So it's like there was something special about Mary, just as you can compare her to Eve herself. And some of them even exalted Mary to the same status, or even at times greater, to a greater status than Eve herself, because Eve, even though was the first woman, brought sin into the world, and Mary, even though a woman, was able to come into the world without sin and became the vessel through which God came into the world. So some of the early church fathers really exalted Mary above like all women generally, including Eve herself. And that's why you see it a lot, at least in the Catholic Church, that Mary becomes a very, very pivotal figure in the church, right? And that's why, like, at least when you look at a lot of Catholics, Mary becomes a very important figure, because she has become such a central figure within the church, not just by the fact that she bore Jesus, but she was able to bear Jesus because she herself, throughout her life up until the time that she brought forth Jesus into the world, was without sin. So she was such a special individual, and that's what made it possible. And I think some of the early church fathers, and I think one is Saint Irenaeus, not so familiar with him, Saint Ephraim from the 4th century. They they spoke very, very purely about Mary, and that she lived her life unstained and unblemished by sin, and that could only happen if her life and even her birth was without sin. So on the basis of Mary's birth not having sin, Jesus could come into the world without sin. And as to how that special grace actually worked for Mary to come into the world without sin, I cannot explain. If you have a way to explain it, I'm happy to hear. If you have any objections, let's discuss it in the comment section. But basically, the whole point is that Mary is some sort of new Eve, right? That was through her, another human being herself, and then also Jesus Christ, who come into the world without sin. And on the basis of that, Jesus could fulfill his ministry and be able to die and resurrect and to save us from sin. So this is a little summary of the concept of Immaculate Conception. There's still a lot of open questions about it. I'm happy to sort of receive comments and different viewpoints, alternative viewpoint from anyone that has something to say about the topic. But yeah, I'm sort of curious how Protestants try to look at this central question. How was Jesus born without sin, or do they even make the claim that Jesus was born without sin? I'm curious to hear that from any Protestant here, or any person that might have an answer to this central question that might avoid this doctrine of Immaculate Conception, or might have a better explanation about this Immaculate Conception. So thanks for watching, and please subscribe and share this video, and hopefully I'd like to see you in my subsequent videos. Thank you very much. Bye.